Good afternoon. Actually, good evening. Like I said, this video is showing up somewhat late. I worked on Georgia Baptists during the Revolution for my research topic, and I looked into that through the lens of really what is an individual story, because at the end of the day, the fight for religious liberty comes down to a bunch of individual stories, normal people taking a stand against the establishment for the betterment of themselves and their neighbors. In the case of Georgia, we're going to look at the case of Daniel Marshall. Daniel Marshall was a Baptist minister in Georgia, who founded the First Baptist Church in Georgia, Keokee Baptist Church, in Keokee Creek. And I want to backtrack and talk a little bit about Daniel Marshall so that you can get an idea of the type of man that he was, and the fact that honestly he was not all that spectacular. The main thing to consider with Daniel Marshall is really that all of the things that people said about George Whitefield, all the things that people said about Jonathan Edwards, about Shubal Stearns, about many of the great preachers of the day were things that they did not say about Daniel Marshall. And yet he was incredibly effective through a willingness to work, a willingness to travel, and a willingness to connect with the common person. Daniel Marshall was born in Connecticut in 1706. Throughout his childhood, he had a Christian religious education. Upon graduating and finishing his studies, he became a deacon at the local Presbyterian church. He had very devout parents, and his station at deacon is one that he would maintain for the next 20 years of his life. It wasn't until he was 38 years old that he moved on from the deaconship and began his work as a Baptist minister. He was baptized by his brother-in-law, Shubal Stearns, and shortly thereafter, him and Shubal Stearns began a partnership in ministry where they moved to Sandy Creek, North Carolina, and started the Sandy Creek Church and began their work in North Carolina and Virginia. They traveled around for many years, establishing small local churches that were autonomous institutions, and converting people and baptizing people along the way. And Daniel Marshall did this for years, and while other people around him were having legal confrontations, having issues with the Anglican establishment, Daniel Marshall avoided this for quite some time. He then moved on to travel into South Carolina and Georgia in 1768. Was the first time that he really encountered severe legal trouble in Georgia. He was arrested, made to appear before a magistrate, and then told not to preach there anymore, which is interesting because 3 years later, he founded the First Baptist Church in the state. Daniel Marshall, along with many congregants of the Sandy Creek organization, moved south into Georgia to establish their church in the face of challenges from the Anglican establishment and really the threat of being jailed, fined, beaten, and all around possibly killed. Those around Daniel Marshall said of him that he wasn't particularly smart, he wasn't a particularly good speaker, and he wasn't a particularly talented author. And yet, he was very effective in establishing churches in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And I really would point to the main thing being Marshall's courage and his willingness to work hard. He traveled throughout Georgia as well, through the main hub of his Keokee Baptist Church, establishing smaller churches, connecting with people on the fringes and the frontier, lesser represented populations. And that willingness to connect with people who the Anglican Church had forgotten really gave him the ability to spread the Baptist mission. Also, during the Revolutionary War, Marshall, who at the time was 65 years old, was more than willing to stick around. He did not flee in the face of danger as many did, and he was many times threatened and persecuted as an old man for sticking around and continuing to preach. This courage gave him a lot of currency with the local population, who saw the way that Marshall was being persecuted and the way that they themselves are being persecuted by the Church of England. And that's what I really based my project, my research paper around, was the idea really that the disestablishment of the Anglican Church, the wall of separation between church and state, and the achievements of religious liberty in the United States were made by men like Daniel Marshall. Average, normal, everyday guys who were willing to put in the work, who were willing to take a stand. And the collection of those people throughout the colonies standing up and pushing back achieved religious liberty in the face of an Anglican institution that constantly threatened, coerced, and in many instances harmed people who were dissenting ministers and congregations. I hope you've learned something. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you, and good luck in your future classes.